All right, so in the last video, we talked about how if we want a recipe in a cookbook, we can make a copy of that recipe by writing it down. That recipe is very similar to the one that's contained into the cookbook, although it is slightly different perhaps in texture. So there's a difference between a copied page or a recipe card than from an actual cookbook itself. Ditto for a recipe off of the internet. Similarly, mRNA contains the same information that the DNA contains, but it has a slightly different chemical form. All right, so once the DNA is copied or transcribed is the word that we would use in molecular biology and biochemistry terms. So once our DNA is transcribed into mRNA, the messenger RNA can then leave the nucleus and it goes out to other parts of the cell. All right, so let's jump back to our cookbook analogy. We had our original recipe, we copied it to share with other people, but we're not actually interested in the recipe. We're interested in the delicious cinnamon rolls. Similarly, the mRNA is just an intermediate on our way to an end goal, which is the protein that we need to do a particular job. So the mRNA will go to a part of the cell called the ribosome, which then translates the mRNA into a protein that then goes off and does its job. Okay, so why is this important? So way back in the day, with the original vaccines, what scientists would do is they would take a virus, they would weaken it, and then inject that into somebody's arm, all right? And then what would happen is that virus was weak enough that it wouldn't do any long-term damage, but it still looked like the virus, and so our bodies could create an immune response to it. This is actually the science that is behind the between the COVID-19 vaccine, that's the Johnson & Johnson. However, the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines are what are called mRNA. And yes, that is the same mRNA that we talked about that was the intermediate step in our recipe. So those vaccines aren't actually injecting the virus. They are injecting the mRNA that codes for the spike protein. The spike protein is like a tiny coating on the outside of the virus. And that's the part that's responsible for like digging into the human cells, interacting with them, and then convincing the cells to let the virus in. All right, so what we are doing is as those vaccines create the instructions for one part of the virus and only one part of the virus, not the whole thing. Why is that important? Like and follow again for part 3.